happy day. I want to talk about the life cycle of the proletariat. Here's a long time ago. I was talking to David Cartwright about a lot of the themes and ideas that are in the film. And so he goes off and starts producing it. And then all of a sudden I get a message saying, it's done, here. So now I get this thing longer than 2 hours, just a gigantic, enormous watermelon-sized thing. So I watch it through. It's not easy to grasp it. I have this large thing, and also there's some narratives by other speakers that were in the sound track that are supposed to be built around. So I'm trying to figure out what the structure is and what the form and what's happening and what is it saying, and so I just have to watch it a lot, and just trying to get the contours and the structure. So then after this, Dave, I was going to produce the music to the score, and then Dave was going to listen to it, and then he was going to make a full color version based on his interpretation of the music with the first whitish layer, very white but still color drenched film here and there, but this one would be like full spectrum color. Then what was going to happen is he was going to merge the layers together, the two together. Then the idea is to show each version, each one of the three versions would be projected in a theater, so that the person watching each person could listen to the soundtrack, and then what they could do was they could look at whichever screen they felt was most appropriate. Maybe they could watch it another time and look in other places. So very much like this idea. And so I started coming to some conclusions about it as I was watching it. And the thing is, it begins, this is how I view it structurally, is it has sort of a prequel. First industrialization, then commercialization, and then militarization. So there's a lot to notice about this, because let's say if you're putting music to it and you start going, okay, I'm going to have a lot of detail here, and I'm going to, when this happens, this is going to happen, and so forth. And then as it transitions from this to this, okay, then we'll have something that mirrors this and something that mirrors this, but then you start to realize that there's a real granularity in the transitions. So for instance, you might have some people grinding through a hallway in a dreary fashion on the way through a cage to their work. It's very grim. Well, the thing of it is that thing doesn't just sit there and exist in its one place. A little snippet of it occurs. Then the rest of this sort of theme. Now it occurs again. Now it occurs again more. And this thing is sort of present in a granular way until at the very end, as it starts appearing less and less. And so a lot of the events that are happening are kind of like that, and so when, as you're putting things together, you kind of realize that these images are referring back to each other, and that events that occur at the big summation and militarization, well, they sort of start appearing early on, and they're sort of present, implying other things. But say, as someone writing music, it's your dream come true. It's what you love. There's nothing better than to build up leitmotifs and have them reappear in different forms, and so that at the end, when they really start to happen, they have an extra amount of punch because they've been developed. So that's all a pretty good thing. Now, when the music was finished, it's 2 CDs. I think 63 minutes for the first one, and who knows, 65, 67 for the next one. The CDs really split the film in two, and they sort of really mirror what's going on. So at the beginning of the formative part, where it's very innocent, it has humble beginnings, and it has conception and all the various things that lead to childbirth, and it's the beginning. It's full of promise, and I really like this section. It was a really good place to get started because there's lots of scenes that have planetary, very colorful planetary shots that grow out of these sort of youthful images and showing a lot of promise. And so if one could imagine someone were in a euphoric state, experiencing high degrees of endorphins, okay, the music is sort of alpha music, and this music sort of laminates to the early images. As all of these begin, the form of the music is really tied to the film. Now, say in the first CD, okay, what happens is it goes from those very positive beginnings and goes through the difficult periods of mankind's development historically. And then it comes up to industrialization. And starting there, of course, that's kind of like the hope, of man coming out of the medieval days and the various primitive situations that they had to go through. Well, what happens is with industrialization, then things can be mass-produced. There's new technologies, and there's so much promise to it, and a lot of what is good about the modern 8 days, which are much different in quality than what came before them, shows that promise, but then very quickly turns into the very dark features of mechanization, and some of them being the factory work, and some of them being what happens when you start mechanizing things to do with life. Before I go beyond there, I'll just say that the CD, somewhere along the way, breaks free of its very strict lamination to the film, whereas, for instance, the music is playing, and it's very dependent on the images for its context. You really want to see them both together, but then all of a sudden the music starts breaking free from that, so that it's more standalone, and it starts delivering more force. So now instead of just being adjoined to the video, it starts pushing the video, because the video starts pushing itself towards a crescendo, and so the music breaks free, gets very specific, and starts going to a crescendo. Then the second CD follows the same pathway of close lamination to the film. Music starts being more standalone and breaks free, and then the two together but separately are pushing towards the forceful conclusion. And so that's sort of the big overview of that. There's an exception. The first CD has such positive outlines at the beginning, but when the start of the second CD are very dark. Sound construction that's very musical. And so, but it's much darker. And the reason is as you come to the end of the industrialization, it begins commercialization, which is a very, very strange hybrid, because at the beginning of it is something so dark and sinister that it's sort of out. It's like a Popeye arm to some little stick for the rest of the stuff, because the other stuff is it's quite different. And in fact, I view the beginnings of commercialization, and it makes sense why it was included as commercialization, but it's very typical of that granularity, where the transition away from industrialization doesn't just hop out of industrialization. And the animal section really is the culmination of the evils of mechanization, because it's mechanized cruelty. And so the very last song on the first CD is Recompense for Life, and that one is the beginning of that section, and then the constructed sound builds around the continuation of that. And so, so in a sense, you really are sort of in you are gradually into the commercialization section, but you're really still back in the industrialization. And so then it continues, and ultimately, when it gets to militarization, then that's when it's sort of the final conclusion of the whole piece. Now, the music, even though it was outlined like this, in the way I just mentioned, there's a lot of specificity. There's lots of little tiny events, little micro events, and the music is reacting to those micro events. Much the way when you see the sun, there's a reaction to that. When you see yellowish features in the film, when you see certain motions or certain things hitting other things, and things happening, is that there's always, from the beginning to the end, there's a very strong connection into the details of the film. So, and it sort of peaks when La Bamba happens, La Bamba A, and during the great conclusion of the militarization section. At the very end of militarization, and this is the part I really liked about the film, and I knew I was going to like writing the music to it when I saw the very end, when there's this whole build-up and this whole tragedy, and this whole tragedy is expressed through warfare, and it begins its lowly beginnings in trench warfare and stabbing and puncture and shooting, and then as the bombing amplifies, and then there's an aftermath, and that was the really cool part, where all of a sudden you see the total destruction of those events, and you see the victims of those events sitting there in the wake of that destruction, trying to do things to continue. There's a beautiful scene of a lone man on a bicycle going down the street after the city's been devastated by an A-bomb. And the very last piece is the aftermath of the rulers. And to me, what the film is sort of demonstrating is it's demonstrating the net effects of what the various rulers have been doing, that they've been forcing these things, that all of this carnage and so forth is by design. And let's just take the A-bomb, for instance, which closes out the film. You know, if you go back in time, you know, the Romans went to war, and they went to war for plunder, for gain. You were supposed to go to war because you got something. You got slaves, you controlled more stuff, and it was purely greed-based. But in the course of things after that, there was something that there's unbelievable numbers of examples of ego-based wars, where you know, somebody's doing something because of how great they'll look. I believe Alexander the Great, his later battles were about his ego, that they weren't necessary and they were pretty pointless, and a lot of stuff he did, you know, was a mental thing that occurs to rulers, and even, you know, occurred to some Romans, like Caligula and so forth, that were strongly based in the ego. And you take, for instance, King Henry VIII and his invasion of northern France, and his reason for going there was so that he'd be remembered, so that you know, he was thinking of his place in history. He didn't understand that his place in history was definitely very solid, maybe not in the way he'd like, but he went there. All these people went there, suffered a great deal, bunches of them died. It was a complete disaster. He comes back to England after, yeah, I took that little place over, yeah, and a little bit after he came back, they lost it. So it was all pointless and in vain. And you go up to World War I, you know, all of Europe and everywhere, it's functioning pretty good. You know, people people have access to food. They have jobs. They're doing various things. The arts are flourishing, and suddenly these leaders who were across Europe, who were actually all related, are caught up in the silliness of the glories of war. It's what history kind of inflicted on everybody, where everyone looks at the conquerors and then views them with honor, which maybe shouldn't be done. But so with everything being perfect, all these guys conspire to start a stupid war. They all thought it would be over very quickly, and it ends up just completely ravaging everywhere. Just, you know, shortages, starvation, massive death, disease. It was all created from nothing, typically by rulers. For instance, if you look at, you know, Russia's history, that stuff is there, and just everywhere you look. And so there's sort of a madness to it. Well, World War I did teach the Japanese something, that, you know, you could go and use war to further your aims. You could get the Roman methodology where your country benefits. That was, you know, out on the surface. But the Japanese militarists were very much creatures of ego. And if you look how they wasted people all through the islands, just having everyone fight to the death, and long after the war was completely lost, well, they just kept going. And in fact, it's an amazing thing. An A-bomb is dropped on one of the major cities, Hiroshima, and that's, you know, the militarist they just want to keep going, and they want to keep going because they want to stay alive a few more days, kind of like Hitler in his bunker, sending bunches of young children to go fight the Russians so he could live just a little bit longer. This is the view of a ruler. They're kind of they're separate. They don't care about the sufferings of all these people. They don't care about the people they're sending out into the messes that they create, because they're not connected to it. If they were going over the top and running into the machine gun bullets, you'd have different policy. So you see the complete vacuum afterwards of this is what they achieved. This is what the militarists achieved: the complete destruction of their country. Such a dark movie and such an end, but to me, I view the movie as actually having a very positive message, something that's very uplifting. And out of that is that if you think about it, the earth is coated in a crust of rulers, of ruling class. Since recorded history, there are a few places where that doesn't happen, and you can see the benefits where that is more mild or close to missing. But what it is in North Korea, Myanmar, every continent, Asia, Africa, South America, North America, every place is coated by rulers that abuse their citizens, take financially from them by force, which is one of the main points, which is that they sort of view everybody as a source of plunder. And right now, we're approaching a zone where if the people of the world will realize just two things. One, the importance of empathy for life, the importance of eliminating suffering. And two, the idea of if they remove the grip of the ruling classes across the earth, if they're not allowed to do the negative things that they do, if they're contained, and they're contained to tasks which are ones like protecting everyone, and then providing some structure, but then not allowing them to do any of the other pernicious things that they do en masse, the earth would have a renaissance. That with those two factors, it would be another step forward in the long, steady movement ahead that mankind has been going through since its primitive beginnings. We're still really young. Man is really just sort of waking up. If you get a circumstance where, they control the abuses from above, they basically have a deep desire that suffering be eliminated wherever it possibly can rationally. That's a pretty good goal. That's a pretty good place. Right now, all of our advantages socially and so forth came from people in the past that fought things like slavery and fought against a lot of toxic things that were built into culture. At some point, crucifixion was considered normal, like slavery was considered normal and okay. And eventually, over time, people said, no, we don't need that. And we can keep moving forward more. It can get better. But they have to address where the source of all these problems comes from. And I think that's one of the really good, positive things that comes out of this film. This is my interpretation.